It's the Growing for Market podcast.
Every time I talk about how to get going in farming to people, I say, explore a group purchase, explore a group purchase. Find some group of people where the uncle just wants a weekend place. He doesn't want the farmland, and where it doesn't even have to be people that you're soul buddies with. It just has to be people who conglomerately want a collection of things, and different of them want different parts of it. And I have yet to see this happen, but I keep hoping that some people will be lucky enough to do that we were lucky enough to be invited in. We couldn't have done this by ourselves.
Hello, and welcome to the Growing for Market podcast, where we talk about growing, marketing, and the business of growing flowers and vegetables for local markets. I'm Andrew Mefford, your host and the editor of Growing for Market magazine, proudly celebrating 35 years in 2026 as the magazine by and for vegetable and flower market farmers. If you're enjoying the podcast, just wait till you see the magazine. Go to growingformarket.com for more. Also, if you could give us a follow and a rating, it really helps other like-minded people find the podcast. And now, let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. If you grow for market, you know performance is everything. That's why so many farmers are turning to Burpee's Farmers Market. Dedicated to professional growers, Burpee is now offering non-GMO seeds in larger quantities, bred and selected for standout flavor, strong yields, and the kind of visual appeal your customers crave. All farmers market varieties are trialed at Burpee's Research Farm in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, where expert horticulturalists test for germination rate, vigor, disease resistance, high yield, and consistency, things that make a difference in the field and to your bottom line. The seed assortment includes USDA certified organic varieties, Burpee bred classics, heirlooms, and exciting new introductions. Burpee's been doing this for 150 years, and they're still creating new varieties with growers like you in mind. You can check out the full lineup at burpee.com/farmersmarket. That's burpee.com/farmersmarket. Today's episode of the Growing for Market podcast is brought to you by BCS America. On our farm, we've had our BCS two-wheel tractor for over a decade, and with no belts to slip, its all-gear-driven construction is still going strong. Though we originally got it for rototilling, we kept it even when we went mostly no-till because it can do so many other things around the farm. From snow blowing, to making raised beds with the rotary plow, to chipping wood, it can do just about anything you might need on a farm with the right attachment. Need to shred a cover crop? A BCS flail mower will make quick work of even the most vigorous cover crop and chop it up so it breaks down quickly. Want to stir in compost or amendments without inverting soil layers? A power harrow turns your BCS into a precise tilthing machine with depth control so you don't mix deeper than you want to. With so many attachments to choose from, it truly is the Swiss Army knife of farm implements. It's why, instead of saying two-wheel tractor, so many people just say BCS. Tractors and attachments are on sale through the end of the year. Visit bcsamerica.com to find sale pricing and your nearest dealer. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Chip Planck to the Growing for Market podcast. Chip and his family ran Wheatland Vegetable Farm from 1973 through 2010 in Loudoun County, Virginia, about 50 miles northwest of Washington, D.C. Chip just published a book called Sky Blue Trades, Essays and Epiphanies from 37 Years of Vegetable Farming that chronicles that time in a series of essays. Instead of a how-to book, this is more of a philosophical reflection on almost 40 years of market farming. Over that time, they were vendors at multiple DC area markets, including my hometown farmers market in Falls Church, Virginia, and still were when we started doing that farmers market in 2006. So without further ado, welcome to the Growing for Market podcast, Chip.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yes, it's so great to have you. I really enjoyed your book, and you are the kind of person that I would have wanted to have on the podcast anyway. So I'm just so pleased to be able to have your book as a nice hook to hang that on and excuse to get you on the show. So I should mention that I grew up in Falls Church, Virginia, which is one of the suburbs where you did a farmer's market for many years, and I don't think we've ever met in person, but when we started doing the Falls Church farmer's market in 2006, your wife and farming partner Susan was usually the one doing that market, and she was so welcoming which meant a lot to us because we had just started a farm as brand new farmers doing this farmers market for the first time. We were a little bit nervous about just getting our farm off to the right start. And then, there's always politics at farmers markets. We worked for a number of years. I guess we worked for 3 years on other people's farms before starting that market. And so, we'd done a lot of farmers markets. We knew there were always politics and things. And we just weren't, we didn't know if people would think we were horning in on their turf with, what we were selling and all that kind of stuff. So it was so nice just to see Susan every week. And she was so friendly and welcoming to us. It meant a lot to us back then. And I really appreciate that. And I also want to mention that your daughter, Nina Planck, has also been on the podcast before. People may know she's the author of the Farmers Market Cookbook and the book Real Food, What to Eat and Why. Obviously influenced by growing up on the farm. So this makes you the first father-daughter team to ever be on the Growing for Market podcast. So listeners can go look up her episode if they're interested to know more about that. But mainly, I'm just so excited to talk about your book and your experiences because I know that you were market farming for so many years and had so many workers over that time. There's a lot there. So maybe the place to start would be that I know there was a back to the land movement going on in the late 60s and 70s. So people might assume that's how you got into farming, but I know that's not exactly the case. So can you tell us what you were doing before you started farming and how you came to start a farm?
Yes. In the early 70s, I was an assistant professor of political science at the University of Buffalo, State University of Buffalo. And that was a time of general tumult in American education and American politics. And it led one to think about other ways of organizing society, I guess you'd say, people were making a large-scale ideological critique of whatever America had become or whatever they claimed it had become. And so one of the parts of that critique that interested me was people studying so-called intentional communities, kibbutzim and communes, which are contemporary, and kibbutzim, which were not, and then what you might call partial category intentional communities like free schools or an undertaking that looked at just one aspect of society that you might rebuild. And I like this because it was small scale. It was something you might actually do and not just read about. And it was nonviolent. It was sort of voluntary stepping outside of a system of values to see what one could do, which was attractive to me. One of the terms that are used in anarchist literature are direct action. And what that sounds like is a really angry person throwing a bomb at someplace and stopping it cold. That's direct action. Well, another definition of direct action is that your protest should mirror or exemplify the end goal that you want to see. And the purest possible example that all of us know about would be this lunch counter sit-ins, where the lunch counter protest was precisely what people wanted to see as the outcome, and so there was no space between means and end. And that struck me as a more attractive way to think about growth. Anyway, so I got interested in intentional communities and was part of an experimental college at Buffalo where one of the things we taught was that approach to things. And at the same time, we had met Tony and Hugh Newcomb of Potomac Vegetable Farms at that period in our life. And so the example of an alternate agricultural enterprise was front and center in our lives. And we gradually got interested in what it would be to go back to the land in this sort of context. I don't know whether the phrase back to the land is relevant or not. We were interested in farming,
Yeah.
And if you're going to farm, you're going to be near the land. And so that's part of the definition. And so I think the interest in that kind of social activism, the fact that we also had direct contact with a version of it in the agricultural world, and that also our kids were getting out of diapers and we were looking for something that might be a different mode of family life than just me going to work and Susan being a housekeeper, which she was happy to have been. But it was time for that next phase of thinking about how we would organize ourselves. So I think we were sort of situationally ready for thinking about a different setting to organize our family. So it certainly was about back to the land, but it was also about a particular kind of reaction to the tumult of the larger society, which was going on, and looking for a way to be involved in that was compatible. It wasn't just yelling and screaming, and it wasn't just objecting to things in a general way, but not having any particular thing to say would be the alternative. So that sort of collection of tendencies was behind our interest in moving to a situation where we could all work together and as a family and under one of these more positive formats.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, that strikes me that it's perhaps along the lines of be the change you want to see in the world kind of things, which is funny because when I was getting more interested in agriculture, I have a friend, very close friend, who's very academically minded. In fact, he's a professor at a university now. And so I was telling him how interested I was getting in agriculture for a lot of reasons. And he was like, of course, he was like, oh, you should go back to school and become a professor of agriculture. And I was like, no, yeah. I was like, no, I want to do it, and I mean, not only did I not want to spend the rest of my life in a cubicle, but yeah, I felt like it was what I wanted to do, but also that's what we need is more people doing it, not more people talking about doing it.
Right,
so
right.
I think I see where you're coming from there. You mentioned in another thing that you point out in the book was your close alliance with Tony and Hugh Newcomb of Potomac Vegetable Farms, right, who I know a little bit just from growing up in that area and have been out to their farm. And I was familiar with them when I was a kid because we drove past one of their locations, the one on Route 7 in Vienna, Virginia, if people know the area. And they still are one of the last farms in what has become a heavily urbanized, suburbanized kind of area.
Third generation, 50 years.
Yes. Well, and podcast listeners may also be familiar with Potomac Vegetable Farms from Ellen Polishuk because she also has been on the podcast, and she was a longtime associate of Potomac Vegetable Farms. So,
right.
Can you tell us a little bit about the collective land purchase with Potomac Vegetable Farms that helped you establish the farm there in Loudoun County?
I am glad this is so crucial. That they existed as a farm that we could see and relate to, and we actually worked there as volunteers one summer when I was still mainly teaching. And they aren't dumb. They knew how to draw volunteers to the farm to work for the experience of being on the farm. But they were looking to get a piece of land which would be useful for longer term planning than the bits and pieces of suburban land that they were renting being closer into Washington, closer into DC. So they were looking at his land. We appeared looking for a place to do this new phase in our lives that it turned out would be part of their activities. And we were fortunate to be welcomed into that group purchase. And the purchase was of 400 acres. None of the four people that bought that land could have bought the single 400-acre piece by themselves. They were getting it at a reduced acreage price, which goes with basically a wholesale purchase. So 4 different people, the Newcombs, 2 different Oberlin friends, and ourselves were involved in this collective purchase, which allowed us all to get a purchase on farmland in the Washington suburbs without paying retail rates.
Yeah.
And the Newcombs in particular signed our loan portion of that deal, which we had no collateral to have signed on our own because we were not working at the university. We had chosen to get to the Virginia countryside and work as farmers making not very much. And so it was crucial for us, but it was also crucial for the 3 other people involved in this that they all jointly were able to buy a piece of land, which reduced the per acre cost for everybody. And every time I talk, about how to get going in farming to people, I say explore a group purchase. Explore a group purchase. Find some group of people where the uncle just wants a weekend place. He doesn't want the farmland, and where, you can just, it doesn't even have to be people that you're soul buddies with. It just happens to be people who conglomerately want a collection of things, and different of them want different parts of it. And I have yet to see this happen, but I keep hoping that some people will be lucky enough to do that we were lucky enough to be invited in. We couldn't have done this by ourselves. We knew zilch about farming. We knew zilch about land purchases. We just happened to have a very small chunk of money from selling a house in Buffalo where I'd been teaching, and we were able to chunk it all down on our portion of land that Tony countersigned the note on, Tony Newcomb. So.
Yeah, that is great advice because, I mean, land is getting more expensive all the time, and it's hard to afford. So I think that's really good advice for people to think about how they might be able to go in with other people to purchase their farmland. And now let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. This episode is sponsored by Nifty Hoops. Nifty Hoops designs and builds high tunnel systems for growers who want dependable results. What stands out is that Nifty Hoops tunnels are complete systems designed by experienced builders with the details worked out ahead of time. That means the core components are included from the start, like end walls, ventilation, doors, baseboards, and double-layer poly, rather than being added later. The tunnels are designed for real wind and snow loads, efficient assembly, and long service life. You can choose a self-build kit with guidance from written manuals and videos, or a community build where Nifty Hoops works alongside you and the project gets completed in one day. Nifty Hoops has built more than 1,500 hoop houses across the country, including many funded through the NRCS High Tunnel Initiative. They're known nationwide for predictable outcomes and ongoing support. If you're planning a high tunnel project and want it done right, you can learn more at niftyhoops.com.
Hey, it's Lindsay from Grown By. There are a lot of farm sales platforms out there, but there's only one that's cooperatively owned by farmers. And that's Grown By, your all-in-one solution to simplify farm sales. I'm proud and excited to share 2 new features now available on top of the tools you already know and love. Number 1, our customizable CSA box builder. It allows your customers to simply say what they'd like in their share, and Grown By matches their preferences with your weekly harvest. Number 2, our new wholesale-only marketplace. Developed with the Culinary Institute of America, it makes your life easier with a dedicated shop for your wholesale customers. No more texting those chefs. Combining retail and wholesale inventories and records. And, drumroll, automatic payments on due dates. No more chasing down late payments. These new features sit alongside our popular online sales and traditional subscription CSA tools, making it easier than ever to manage your farm's business. As you start to get ready for next season, we'd love to hear from you and see if our cooperative can be a partner in growing your farm. Visit us at grownby.com. That's GROWNBY.com.
And now, back to the show. So, in the book, you talk about how roadside stands didn't prove that lucrative in your rural county, but that there were emerging producer-only markets in Washington, D.C. and its suburbs that proved to be much better markets for you. Why do you say that the producer-only markets were emerging, and what was the market scene like before that?
Well, the first 2 farmers markets west of D.C. were in Arlington and Fairfax, and there was nothing similar to them before they started in 1980. And it turned out that the minute some farmers appeared at the Arlington Courthouse Farmers Market, people were all over them. They were waiting for this to happen. Matter of fact, there's a woman whose name I love, Louise Chestnut, who was just an activist in Arlington County, and she said to the chairman of the Board of Supervisors, why don't you get some farmers down here in the judge's parking lot so we can buy food from them? So she was just a suburban person with food on her brain, and she said, And let's remember, people use terms supply and demand side agriculture. Supply siders claim that if the government gets out of the way, we can sell everything that people want. But this was demand side agriculture. This lady, Louise Chestnut, said, we will buy this stuff if you will bring it near us. And we brought it near them, and they started buying. The farmers didn't figure this out.
Uh-huh.
A few farmers in the region had roadside stands, including the Newcombs. They had a very good roadside stand. They lived on a well-traveled road. It's good for them. I mean, they did exactly what makes sense. They spent a lot of time figuring out how to buy a piece of land and sell off it, etc. But the markets were the first sort of more organized example of responding to what turned out to be a significant demand, heretofore unmanifest, on the demand side for this kind of food. I didn't say that very clearly, but so the markets were a creature of activism on the part of buyers of food or would-be buyers of food, as opposed to an action by farmers to get themselves together. Why don't we all get together on the same street corner and sell a lot of vegetables? Well, dude, they could have, but they didn't, until Louise Chestnut and people like her said, I would love to buy from farmers if they would just come in.
Yeah. Well, thanks for clarifying that, because, I think by the time I became involved in the farmers market scene, that's the way that it already was, that there were already producer markets.
Yeah, 2006 is well into this phase, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that I was kind of came of age farming wise in a pretty good time, because I know from talking to just other people that I've worked with over the years who are farming, like back in the 80s in particular, they thought that was a pretty rough, hard time to be market farming. Like the prices, they were telling me prices weren't very high. Demand wasn't very high for fresh produce. And you can look at the statistics from the USDA, look at the number of farmers markets. It just really went up a lot through the 90s and early 2000s. I know. I just wanted to ask, sort of to give some context that what kind of markets were going on with before producer only markets got set up.
Well, I think it's quite fair to say that all the markets were not good, and that they were tried in many different formats and many different ways. That some would be, local neighborhood groups said, gee, we want to have a farmer's market, let's start one. Some would be started by the Extension Service in a nearby county. A big one that we went to in D.C. proper was started by people who wanted to address the sort of food deserts that are typical of less well-off neighborhoods. And that they didn't especially care if they were producer only or not. They just wanted to get good food into the city. Well, we were happy to sell at a place like that. We basically almost for wholesale prices, but we sold a lot of stuff at wholesale prices, and it was a place to go. We didn't have comparable places everywhere. Some places were way better than others, but we needed all of them because we were experimenting with as many settings as popped up. So there was nothing automatic or uniform about these settings. And it led to a lot of meetings with people who didn't know how to organize anything to get. My favorite example, which I think is in the book, is we started a market in Arlington and everybody drove and sold the first week, just harum-scarum at the parking lot. And then the next week, somebody got up an hour earlier, like the Three Little Pigs, and got there early, and in order to get the early customers. And then when people then equally other people began coming earlier, this guy hired somebody to sleep in his spot. And so when he came there, nobody would. Talk about absolute absurd individual stuff. So all these things needed to organize rational arrangements for the meeting of this demand. But the demand was really there, and it was really clear that if you intelligently organized responding to it, you could sell. At the same time, a lot of markets fail. Implicit in this answer is that other markets were not successful. So it was when you refer to when you started, it may have been that there was some more solidity in the scene, but it was always a hercum-jercum sort of gradual process for these markets these various markets to solidify themselves or not.
Right. And it's the ones that were good that we're still talking about.
Yeah, except that we're not in touch with it anymore, but I hear names of markets and places that I didn't know about before. So people are still starting them. There are some very, very good markets, which are very hard to get into. You're right about that. But the universe is not just solidified into 4 or 5 key markets. There's places are starting variously, continually.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the things that you talk about in the book is how you were doing a lot of farmers markets. Because I think for some of the years you were doing 10 to 15 farmers markets a week.
Yes.
And you mentioned how the bigger weekend markets needed 2 trucks worth of produce and setup and everything. So how many people did you have working on the farm to support 10 to 15 markets a week?
At the sort of height of things in the 90s and the early 10s, we had crews of 12 to 15 people. We went to 10 or 12 markets a week, roughly. It depends on how early in the season, how late you're talking, but that would be fail. Roughly speaking, we went to about 300 markets a year in the prime days of our marketing. And we had a fleet of 5 late model, but not spiffy pickups that went to these markets. And very important, we didn't have to go to all these markets because we also had to run the farm. So we recruited people whom we trusted could go to these markets, A, not wrecking the trucks, and B, not stealing the money, and C, religiously trying to sell the stuff and bring it home and counting all the money accurately. And this is very important in terms of the focus on labor in this book. Is if we didn't have those individual people trainable and reliable to go to some of the lesser markets, as a matter of fact, most of the lesser markets, Susan and I still went to various very big markets on Saturdays and Sundays. We couldn't have generated the income that we had. And so this was, if you're growing a pepper plant to produce peppers, we were growing a labor force to produce people who could run markets. I mean, that was our product and there would have been a natural limit to how much we could have generated if we had to have gone to all these markets because we didn't trust people to drive. We didn't trust people to push the produce. We didn't trust people to not mess up the money, etc. I'm hitting this with a hammer, but it's a key thing to our success. And it may not have been the best model by any means. I'm not saying it's the only way anybody could have gone, but that was the way we went. We very carefully tracked the amount of labor that we spent as a portion of total expenses, and it went up from 10 or 15% to 50%. At the beginning, if you counted our labor costs, they would have been a very small percentage of total costs, and we kept adding labor to the package, and we kept making more totally in the net, that it was clearly the introduction of that, more of that variable that led us to get there. It's not the only thing we had to worry about, but it's the biggest part of our economic story.
Yeah. Okay. And that is important because you talk about labor quite a bit in the book. And I do recommend people to check out the book because I know you're very deliberate about, how you employed people. And you talk about why workers were employees, not interns, apprentices, or volunteers.
Yeah.
I know it's in the book, but can you tell us a little bit about why you really wanted people to be employees and not volunteers or apprentices?
I should be able to say this very precisely. If you were going to have Social Security payments and Medicare payments when you're 65 and up, you have to establish an earning pattern throughout your whole youth before 65. And there are percentages of that you pay in every year, you the worker, and there are percentages that your employer pays in every year. And together they form not technically the amount of money you're going to get back, but because you don't literally get back exactly what you put in, but that establishes the pool of Social Security and medical care money that from which is drawn the amount that retirees are given. And that pool is based, your share of that is based on how much you worked when you contributed and your employer contributed those portions of your earnings to the federal safety net basket. So legally, you can hire somebody as an independent contractor and you just pay them $5 an hour for what they do for you, but you have made no corollary contribution to their Social Security record, and they have made, unless they choose to, made no contribution to from their side, and thus they have only gotten current money, not making any investment on their future returns, which, by the way, we are living off of right now. We ourselves, because we also contributed in a different fashion to the Medicaid and Social Security pool that supports people who are older than 65.
Yeah.
All right. And if people want to know more, you do talk about labor a lot in the book. And I think that's very practical. And you really kind of like explain the philosophy that underlies a lot of what you did in a way that I think is useful for people trying to think about farm labor right now. I mean, labor's always a hot topic on farms.
Yeah, it's not easily done. I mean, an example of something that was simpler for us and maybe harder for other people is we had housing only we didn't have housing for the winter months. And so it was a little chilly in April and a little chilly in October, but it wasn't freezing, and people could work that early phase of the thing and the late phase of the season. And many people nowadays seek out markets so they can go through the winter on. And if they're doing that, they have to have housing one way or another that is winter, the fourth quarter housing. And so we didn't face the same expenditures for labor that we would have needed had we been year round. On the other hand, it just made us decide, we just focused on how much money we could get in the period we could supply our labor force for. All businesses have to figure out what they can sell and what they can't sell. I mean, it's not like an unusual problem.
Right.
We eventually came to pay our workers. So if you could work only during the summer months, you got a certain amount. If you could work in the summer months and the fall, or the summer months and the spring, you got more. And if you came back the second year, you got more. And this is we never chose about how good the worker was. The poorest worker followed those who got the money. And the best worker got the same amount of money, depending on how much they could work in the year.
And how long they had been with us. Seniority was huge.
And whether they came back a second year or a third year. So sometimes the lowliest worker would come back for a second year. They got the money. It doesn't matter whether they were the best worker or the least worker. It was cool. And nobody minded this.
Yeah,
nobody minded this.
Great flexibility in
understood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I just want to reemphasize what Susan said. Generally speaking, if somebody wanted to come back, they were known to be good workers. They wouldn't have wanted to be there so that sort of solved itself. And also, we were very careful when we had a very good worker, even though paid the same hourly as a not very good worker, we made sure that worker got interesting things to do and ran markets or whatever. So there's lots of ways to intervene in this or outcome as opposed to just what the hourly rate is, which is not very interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, reading about your worker accommodations and everything brought back the memories for me, because my wife and I, we ended up apprenticing for a total of 5 years before. Well, what happened is we apprenticed for 3 years. We started our farm in Pennsylvania, got kicked off of the farm in Pennsylvania, and then went back to apprenticing for 2 more years.
Really?
Until we finally found our place up here in Maine. And so, yeah, we were worked on a lot of different types of accommodations in a bunch of different states in the country. And in fact, that reminds me, you wrote an article for Growing for Market magazine a number of years ago called something like 40 acres and 15 college kids, talking about how just sort of like how you handled that, like a pretty high number of workers for most vegetable farms. And I know, we got everything from very small farms to larger farms in the Growing for Market audience. But that's something for people who get the magazine. Everybody has access to the archives. They could go read that, and that would give them an idea of how you handled all those workers.
The more people we had, the more complex the management. On the other hand, the more options you had for grouping A with B and B with C, and giving a different mix of jobs to different people. I mean, it didn't strike me as a problem, more as an opportunity to deploy these various people in various settings. I don't know.
Okay. Well, another thing you talk about in the book is the long-term rise in consumer interest in farmers markets. So as someone speaking as myself, as someone who came of age in sort of like the locavore era, where there was a lot of growth in farmers markets and interest in local food and flowers from the 90s to the early 2000s. Do you have any idea why farmers markets grew so much during that time? Like, I always just kind of assumed people were sick of tasteless grocery store produce, but I just wanted to ask, if, having lived through that time, if you have any other insights on that.
Well, it's a feature of growing environmental consciousness, wouldn't you say? Which is broader than just, can I buy a nice tomato here?
Yeah.
Well, any system that perfects itself, like the Safeway system or the ship fooding system, will have things that it's left behind or aren't addressed anymore. And we sort of filled in some of those niches. And I don't know, it's also a relatively small percentage of the consumer base, so we don't have to knock ourselves out figuring out why they wanted to. It's a small number of people. I do think things like unusual varieties and so forth have gotten into the supermarkets because somebody walked around at the farmers markets and said, these dudes are selling something that we haven't sold. So there's a demonstration effect that is manifest in the other parts of the food system that we could probably take some claim for, but that'd be hard to demonstrate.
Yeah.
I just mentioned it more as when we looked at our production methods of our labor and how we managed it and so forth and so on, we should not forget that the context in which we were proceeding was a growth in demand for the product that we had. And we didn't cause that. We rode that. And so you have to make sure you acknowledge that, because, but it doesn't necessarily explain it as a social event.
Well, no, that's a good point to make. In addition to people wanting better produce, that you're right, people may have been interested in have environmental concerns that made them want to buy from the farmer as well, or just to support that. I figure people probably noticed that the tomatoes weren't that great and there are less farms. And so, okay, that does make sense. Are there any other trends that you noticed in market farming over the years that are worth pointing out to our audience? Well,
it's obvious. I think people who are buying a product like to talk to people who created the product. The food with a face, so-called. We put out a lot of information at our stands, and we put out a lot of verbal information when people ask questions, and that sort of richness of offering it's not really too different from what we talked about, but it's slightly different. It's not the product itself, but it's the sort of the setting of that product. I wanted to say one thing, just which is not directly related to this question at all, but one of the things you have to learn is what your business is. And in general, I think there's a tendency to do too many things. And a business is really doing one thing really well. And it might be a relatively rich, complex thing that you're doing, but it's still one thing. And like there's a reason that there aren't produce sections full of fennel in the grocery stores. And the reason is fennel. We're all sort of saying, oh, wow, I could grow something and Joe Blow is not growing. And it's true you have to grow something or do something that Joe Blow is not doing, because there you are on the pavement right next to him. But all of us, I think, have gone down. And you could just say it's part of experimenting with your business to try something and you have to be willing to back off. But it's always a danger, I think, to be trying to do too many things. And it gets boring when you're doing fewer things. But that's what work is. That's what work is. It's doing the same thing over and over until you get it right. You have to be targeted, and you have to do some things and not try to do all things. And some of those can be exactly what the consumer wants, and some of those can be sort of teaching the consumer what they might want because they hadn't seen it before. But it's more likely something they want that you have to figure out.
Yes, that's a good point. In fact, there's close to the beginning of the book, you say something like, if somebody goes and does a profession for a few years and writes a book about it, you're going to learn more about the person than about the profession. Whereas if somebody goes and does something for, say, 37 years, they're grounded enough in it, you're going to learn a lot about the profession itself.
Presumably.
And so, which I thought was a really interesting idea that I had not heard of before. And there's so much in this book, and a lot of it is somewhat philosophical. We can't cover it all, so people are just going to have to read it. But is there anything that you'd like to make sure and focus on for our audience of market farmers from the book? Because you got complex ideas about labor, there's anecdotes, there's philosophy. I feel like there's a little bit of everything in there. But is there anything in particular that you wanted to make sure and pick out from the book?
Well,
I think Chip didn't intend it to be a book. He just wrote about various aspects of our lives. And then it seemed to fit together to make a book. But it didn't start out to be a book. Is that right, Chip?
No, I mean, I've been writing these things, as Andrew mentioned, for Growing for Market, little bits of things over the years. I have a kind of animus. I think there's just too much disrespect for workers in business. And it's very clear in small business, because small business is sort of transparent. You can see what people are saying or what they're talking about. So I think if you look at workers as an opportunity and not as a necessity or a problem, you might get more out of them. You're asking about things that are sort of implicit here. And also, I enjoy working with all these people. The idea that you would move toward working with fewer people is kind of a funny goal. I understand it as a goal. It's an economic goal and so on. But you almost, anyway, most people I talk to don't want to work with workers. They think workers are a problem. They think paying them is a problem. Well, that's all true. But it is not the same thing as saying, I need a group of people to do something with me that I can't do myself. And this is so cliched sounding. I don't know that it even addresses what you asked, but we certainly enjoyed working with all these people. And I don't mean that all of them were good. Every year at any one point, if you'd ask me in my heart of hearts, do you want X or Y around? I would say, well, we could do without X, but that's not the system. The system was to have a bunch of people, most of whom are there for the right reasons, and sort of group them in such a way that they produce more than they would have by themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting thing to do in the world. And we are good friends with a lot of these people that we worked with.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you must have had hundreds of workers over the years, and I'm sure some of them went on to start farms. I'm sure some of them took their experience on the farm and went off and did other things, but at least they had a better understanding of farms, because as you point out in the book, it's only 1 or 2% of the population that's farming anymore. And I think you also point out that some of the other food adjacent jobs, like meat processing or vegetable processing, that used to be done on farms are now separate industries. And so
the food sector is bigger than we think, right?
Right. I think because we're farmers, we tend to think of like, we look at the drop from, I don't know, 90% of people working on farms a couple hundred years ago to 2% of people working on farms. And that's a good point that you make, that some of the food adjacent things that were done on farms are just now are done in factories or somewhere else. But there's a lot of different philosophies on labor. Like I think there's a quote from Wendell Berry that's, I'm going to butcher this, but something like, some people want to farm so they have no bosses nor employees. Some people see it that way. On the other hand, I think some people who start off like that realize they can't achieve all of their goals on the farm just as a 1 or 2 person operation. And I think that, farming can be a hard job, but it's also a good job. That we were involved in many situations. I don't think we were ever on a farm that had 15 workers like you did, but we were definitely in sort of like group living situations where we cooked together, ate together, and had the whole experience. And I think, and I mean, obviously that was formative for us because we ended up starting a farm. But, I think it's not an experience that a lot of people have anymore. And it's good for one for people to have, obviously, too. Like we had apprentices. And so a lot of them would be college students, who were sort of like, a lot of them didn't necessarily want to start a farm. Some of the apprentices we've had over the years did, but a lot of them just sort of were like interested in where their food came from. And that wasn't a terrible thing. That was, worked out. I hope it worked out on both sides as far as in those instances, we got labor for the season and hopefully they learned something that they probably didn't have experience with. And so even if they didn't go and start a farm, at least they had a lot better understanding of what farming is actually like. And so I think there's a lot there. There's a lot people can learn from the way you guys structured your farm, and particularly your labor, your workers, that I think could be useful for a lot of people.
I think you put it very well, and that we all can have the same experience or similar experiences. Well, yes, we've had a number of people who became farmers, and it's fun to count them up. It's been not a few, but we had a lot of workers, so I don't know what the percentage is. But many, many people have endorsed what you said. I thank you for the opportunity for being here. I really enjoyed learning about this, etc. And they're there for 6 weeks. And they can't stop talking about it, And I don't mean that's the only experience that peak experiences come in a lot of areas, and they can be very small. That's what a peak is. It's small. So I think we can be assured that if you provide the right setting, people enjoy very much getting a little look at it and then going on the way we all did. I went on from political science teaching, after all. So I think you've nailed part of it there. It's not a farming school, but it is also, and just being subject to business logic is new to most people, as that is one of the themes that I'm interested in a lot, is if you're a college student or a high school student for that matter, nobody asks about how efficient you are in writing your papers. You don't even ask yourself how efficient you are. You just finally get it done, or you finally don't get it done. And then you ask for an extension and so forth and so on. You just don't get to do that in the real world. It's just, and not to be snide about it. It's just the nature of schooling is that there's no efficiency component for the individual student. Whereas in the rest of the world, somebody's looking out quite sharply at how much is getting done here and how much is being done. And so that's a nice thing that's going on for the workers, even though they didn't know that's what they were coming to. They thought it would just be fun to work in a farm for a summer, some sentence like that, which is not untrue, but they didn't know what else they might take from the exposure.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think in a way you talk about sort of like the business of farming a fair amount in the book, which I think is important because nobody gets into farming because they like business, right?
Right, right,
But
right.
but it's one of those things. If people are going to stay in business, they, as a farmer, of course, they have to pay attention to, how much it costs to get things done. I mean, that's really the difference between farming and gardening, right? Is that if you're gardening, you can take as much time and money to grow the perfect tomato, the perfect dahlia or whatever. It doesn't matter. Whereas farming, as there has to be a surplus at the end of the year, or else you're not doing it again. So I would say, I feel like that's one of the most practical parts of the book that people can learn from, because there's a few different philosophies to farming. I know you talk a lot about like keeping debt low and getting equipment as you can afford it, as opposed to there's another philosophy about borrowing money to accelerate the growth of the farm. And so you really talk about how you made that work, as far as, I think it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys tried to minimize debt and sort of like, grow the farm as your operation grew, instead of taking on a lot of debt.
Yeah, you could say that was our dumb money theory of business, and that a lot of other people are willing to borrow money and actually make out very well with it. But we were very cautious. Also, our background made us cautious. We had no experience with that. So it can work either way. I think you're right, but it can also work either way badly.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Well, yeah, it's one of those things. There's a couple different ways. I guess you got to have a plan either way. So one plan is to minimize debt and grow very, slowly and gradually as the farm grows. Another philosophy that a lot of people take, can also work well, is to borrow more money up front. Either way, you got to have a plan. So I think
that's right.
You in the book, you basically talk about how you executed on that plan for 37 years. It's a very well thought out explanation of that particular philosophy on farming. And so that could be useful for people in the planning phase to, think about they want to take the slow, low debt kind of approach, or take on more debt and try to grow faster. I think they're both valid approaches. They can both work out and they can both not work out depending on the situation.
Susan has a good observation on this. Says if you will have to work on other farms for a while before you farm, like anything in this world. But if you're going to work at another farm to learn, pick a farm that's a serious farm commercially, and B, is bigger than you're liable to be yourself. So you can be there and not know what the future might be, just what your future might be. And we basically, after having farmed with the Newcombs for 5 years, she wrote up a farm plan, which was kind of a 40% of what we'd seen them do. And without that reference point, you would have been sort of at sea, or you could have been at sea. You can see that. So it was not irrelevant at all to have had exposure to a semi but slightly more ambitious version of what you thought to do. So that's another way of getting a business plan, is sort of reasoning from the businesses that you've seen to what you might happily do or effectively do.
Yeah. That's great advice, because we worked on a number of different farms before we started our farm. And one of the farms that we worked on out in Washington State was pretty big. They had like 100 acres of vegetables. Granted, 20 acres or so was in cover crops at any time. And they would grow like 20 acres of potatoes, right? So there was almost like, they had a big potato harvester and everything. And that was a great experience. I learned a lot, and I also learned I don't want to have a farm that big.
Right.
That's how I learned that. Sort of like you're saying, is go work for somebody who's bigger. And they were a very serious business-minded farm. But it also showed us what processes we could mechanize or scale up. It basically showed us how farms operating larger than we ever wanted to be would streamline things. And so we took those learnings with us, even though we started a much smaller farm.
Yeah, so, absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
That's key.
And now let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. Farming is hard. Running it shouldn't be. Tend helps you plan your season, map your farm, and track every task from seed to sale. No spreadsheets, no guesswork, just seamless workflows. Tend is the all-in-one farm management platform that brings together planning, field mapping, fulfillment, real-time inventory, sales, labor, traceability, and accounting in one easy platform. Built for small market gardens, CSAs, and large diversified farms. Get started with a free account at tend.com. That's TEND.com. No credit card required. And now, back to the show. Well, there's really not that many people who have more market farming experience than you do. Do you have any advice for market farmers who haven't been farming for 37 years? Like something that took you a long time to learn, or something that maybe a lot of people have to learn from experience, which can be a hard way to learn?
I'd say that we started out growing lots of different things and then decided, let's just grow the things that we can really grow and people really want to buy, and diversify those things. So we grew lots of kinds of tomatoes, bunch of kinds of cucumbers, bunch of kinds of beans, and narrowed it down to what we thought tasted really good and were productive. And we dropped the things like celery or things that were hard to grow. And not very popular.
Okay. Yeah. I think a lot of people do that. Start out with an extremely diverse crop selection, sort of like a one of everything in the seed catalog kind of approach, and then whittle it down over the years to what people really want to buy, depending on their market. So,
a sort of more mundane version of this was our basic module was a pickup truck with 3 layers of vegetables and a tarp that would cover those vegetables when you got to market. And the table arrangement, the trestle arrangement that the table sat on, the tarp that you took, all that was as repetitious as we could make it, even though some markets took 2 sets of tarps rather than 1 set of tarps, etc. At a lot of our places, Susan would take whiteout and mark little whiteout things on the pavement, which are not even visible to anybody except us, where the trestles for this bench would go, and then the trestles for this bench would go, and so forth. It was so organized and repetitious as much as we could make it, because otherwise, you're driving there, you're putting your whole thing on the street, and you're picking it back up and going away. I mean, there's a lot of complex things to go. For instance, we had a checklist that you looked at before you loaded as you loaded your truck to go to market. I mean, nothing unusual there. And my line about that checklist, though, was only 2 kinds of people needed to use it: people who'd never gone to market before and people who'd gone to market before. That's what a checklist is all about. It's everybody has to think about these things every time before they go out. And an example of where we had to change things for a while, we had a number of good people back in the 90s, I think, who ran their own market, and they would have their own sign box and take it and have the signs for what they were going to charge and this, that, and the other. And it really became clear that people weren't going to spend a lot of time the night before making their sign box exactly precisely what they wanted and with a plan for where they were going to put some everything. So we took the sign boxes back, and Susan more than I, but we both then would organize a sign box and and these are people that we respect in every other way. But it wasn't an area that they reliably went to, which is the 2 hours of 1 hour before market of sign box. And that doesn't even ring much of a bell, but just so, as many items as could be predicted from that load with a market sheet about what you've got and what the price would be and everything. We had to take that back, and we didn't want to, because that's after dark work. But that was an example of something that, even though we're big labor fans, we didn't allow labor to do, because it didn't do it well enough.
Yeah, it didn't get done. Yeah, the right way. Okay.
So, apropos of what your question was a few minutes ago, you can be very reliant on people, but be very limited in what you allow them to do and what you don't allow them to do. It's not as though you just say, "Hi, we're all here moving vegetables." There was a real structure to things, underneath all these trucks coming and going, all these college sophomores coming and going. And so we had to assess that all the time.
Okay. So one other thing I wanted to ask you about is I think you're there at the farm today. Can you tell us, I know a little bit about this, but can you tell us what's going on the farm today?
This is really interesting.
Yeah.
In 1973, 4 families bought 400 acres of Loudoun County ground, really good ground. We haven't even touched on the fact that our ground is Chester silt loam. It's an excellent ground for growing vegetables. That's one of the reasons we don't talk about growing vegetables so much in this book, because, well, that was not the hardest hurdle to get over. We still had to learn how to grow stuff like that.
Yeah.
100 acres was bought by a lawyer who lived in D.C. who just wanted to buy some land and had no interest in using it. And he took mostly woods of the 400 acres. He took 100 acres of woods.
And we took 60 acres of open ground. The Newcombs took 180 acres of open ground. And the Mutus who run an orchard took
44
about 40 acres, largely open ground. And all three of we've retired. I won't get into we did a land conservation arrangement on our land, so it's kept largely as farmland. We'll leave that aside. The Mutus are basically in the second generation running CSA. Hana Newcomb and Potomac Vegetable Farms are basically in the third generation running a CSA. On 3 acres right outside our window, one of our former workers from Oberlin is still farming full-time on our little bit of acreage here. He's now in his late 30s.
He's 40.
So there's an evolution there. And another friend grew flowers for a while here and now has since retired. In other words, over this 50 years since this happened, a lot of these operations have stayed intact, but varied in the way they're producing and who they're producing with and everything. I'm not giving a good example, but it's a nice long-term example of a stable rural culture, which is not just about farming. People will have programs on other stuff. I didn't say that well. So it's
all farm related.
Yeah.
400 acres farm related.
Like workshops in rural skills or some social justice kinds of things, organized largely by the second and third generation people who are of these families that made the first purchase. Newcomb CSA is big, several hundred members.
But they have markets too.
They go to markets too. Our worker does a CSA. Our former Oberlin worker does a CSA largely on his own. And the Mutus have a so-called all season or whatever you call it, what's the word? It's the CSA.
Yeah, a full diet CSA or something like that?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Okay, because I didn't realize the Mutus were part of that land purchase also, because I know Rob a little bit.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, okay. And I did see that they had started doing a full food CSA. I'll have to get him on the podcast. I'd like to ask him about that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll reach out to him.
Yeah.
By the way, and he counts as second generation because his dad had, his dad and granddad actually had the peach orchard in Vienna for a while and then planted it out here in Loudoun for a while too. Yeah. So Rob has gradually had to give up growing fruit because the chemical demands are so great, and so they just. But anyway, no, you're absolutely right. You should get him as part of this and Hana Newcomb, if you want to articulate.
You're right. Yeah, I should reach out to her.
Fantastic. Good idea.
And what I would like to do is write up something that sets the stage back in 1973 or whenever it was that these 4 different families bought these, and then have each family write the history of how they have, over the years, used this part of that rural Loudoun for a different outcome or whatever. Because it's not really just about anyone particular. It's all the concurrent activities that use this prime agricultural spot. And they're going to keep using it. It's really very encouraging.
what we did with our 60 acres was to sell 40 acres to Rob Mutu, 10 acres with a separate house to another 2 farming people, successive farmer owners, and 10 acres to create a hamlet. Because somehow we had the idea that a hamlet was a good development, not large lot development, but tiny lot development. So we had this hamlet notion. Nina came back from England and said, so what are you planning on? What are your dreams? And Chip said, to build a hamlet. And I said, to build a hamlet. And she said, well, who could help us build a hamlet? So we knew somebody, and it materialized. So 7 houses occupying only 2 acres. So, the remaining 8 acres, whatever, is septic fields and open space and stuff like that. So it was kind of like a second occupation for us, the hamlet.
Yeah.
Okay. So you call it a hamlet because it's like the way agricultural communities used to be set up, where the houses are clustered.
Yeah.
So you're still living there on the farm in a cluster of houses, and then the farmland around you is preserved.
Yeah, we actually
in fact, we bought 5 acres from the man who bought the 100 acres of woods. He moved to North Carolina and decided to sell. And he created a 5-acre lot with a house that he had built, to a cottage that he had built. And so we said, let's buy John Graybeal's 5 acres. So we don't live on our 60 acres anymore. We live right next to it, in 5-acre piece.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a much more sensible manner of development than, having grown up in that area. I'm very familiar with the urban sprawl and, houses just spread out across what used to be good agricultural land.
Yeah.
Just spread out on medium-sized lots, taking up what's otherwise really good farmland. So I think that's a really cool idea that people could profit from. I know, because whether you want to call it succession planning or, basically like how to handle the farm and keep it in farmland is also always a hot topic.
Yeah,
and I think
right.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, people can benefit from or learn from what you've done there.
Yeah.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. You've been very generous with your time. Is there anything else that I should have asked you, or anything that you'd like to say before we let you go? I always like to ask people, sometimes maybe I haven't asked the most important question. So I always like to ask people just if there's anything else I should have asked.
Well, we are going to start a cemetery on this 400 acres.
Yeah.
In case you're wondering about ultimate succession.
Yeah.
Okay.
Things.
Yeah. All the Mutus and the Newcombs are all for this.
Oh, the Hamlet Cemetery. Okay.
Well, it'd be larger than 400 acres.
Be on the
reason.
Newcomb property.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are lots of people buried here already. This farm had 50 slaves. This farm had 400 acres on this side that we bought, and 100 acres on the other side of the major road. And they had 50 slaves. So they're buried here sometimes.
They were named.
Do you know where the graveyard is, or is unmarked?
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The slaves were mentioned in the will by name, and the horses were mentioned in the will by name.
Yeah.
In the 1860 will.
Yeah.
I think, just to repeat, we are so fortunate that the Newcombs and the Mutus and the Graybeals bought this 400 acres in 1973, and that the several agricultural operations that gave a spot for have continued through the second and third generations and continue to do a lot of serious farming, but adding other things, which I couldn't articulate very well a minute ago, but art and social justice stuff and things like that. So we really are fortunate to be part of a vibrant, long-term rural subculture here. And it's completely related to this 400 acres being bought at one time by 4 different like-minded people. Because if not, it would have dispersed, and not necessarily in a bad way, but not in this way. Because we all get together for potlucks, we all get together for shows, but everybody is still autonomous in their economic decisions. It's not a commune in any, you know what I mean? It's not a communal arrangement of resources. And yet it's a bunch of like-minded people. And I feel extremely grateful for that. And we'll get to be buried here.
So here's something, pieces of paper come to the surface in my handwriting. This is 1987, called Newcomb Principles. Don't spend on non-farm expense items. These cost you more because you have to earn their cost plus the income tax that you paid to have the $25 left over. Do spend on farm expense items that make you money, like equipment or labor. They cost you less because you reduce your tax liability with each of them. Pay people as self-employed workers. You don't pay Social Security taxes, though. Number 4, buy real estate. Forced savings for mortgage payment goes up in value. I don't know what forced savings or mortgage payments. Goes up in value, provides farm expense deduction if you farm it. Interest, taxes, depreciation. Rent out part of it. It provides land, trees for fuel and lumber, etc. And save money all the time. That's correct.
Yeah, well, they're good principles.
Definitely. Don't give money to your kids. Pay them. Don't give money to your kids. Pay them. You get farm expense deduction. They get interest on their money that's tax-free. You can borrow from them without stock, points, etc.
You can borrow from your children. That's a good one. 11-year-old, 12-year-old, whatever. But,
yeah,
we came into the setting with like no business background.
Yeah.
She'd been a babysitter. I'd been
But we were frugal. Our parents were frugal and we were frugal.
So the sort of subculture of these things is always interesting.
Yeah.
I've been a paper boy and she'd been a babysitter. Well, we're lucky that you were there having taken over that magazine.
You are.
What do you know about Lynn? Is she fine? Or yes or no? Uh-huh.
Yeah. Last I heard, it's about a decade ago that I took the magazine over from her. And so I spent some time out in Kansas learning how to run the magazine, and I rented a box truck. And, there's not that much stuff actually associated with the magazine since, we don't print it. We still use a big printer out in Kansas City, or I guess they're actually in Topeka. But, we still use the printer in Kansas. And so, we've kept in touch, and she's actually wrote a book a couple years back, but it sounds like she and Dan are doing well and still out there in Kansas. Yeah,
they were lovely people. Arlen.
They really are. I'm always grateful to her for thinking of me when it was time to pass Growing for Market on.
Well, it's going to be a great institution over many years. It already is, but it's going to. I don't mean to get you out of the picture. I just mean it'll no doubt stay in good hands.
Yeah, sure. No, well, this is our 35th year.
Oh,
So,
wow.
In fact, she started it back in I guess it was 92. If we're in 35 this year. So, I hope that the podcast is, it's just a broadening. We're just trying to, make use of all the tools that we can to keep growing the magazine. And so, but I think in fact, you may know she and her family took over the business Seeds from Italy. And so
I remember hearing that, but
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so after Growing for Market, they bought the business Seeds from Italy, which is the exclusive importer of, I think it's Franchi seeds. from that is a old Italian seed company, and then her kids, or one of her kids, took that business over. So I think she and Dan are more or less retired now. With her I guess her kids didn't want to take over the magazine. That's why I'm here, but they did want to take over the seed business. So I think she's mostly retired, and now her kids run the seed business.
Mm-hmm.
So
Very nice.
but last I heard, they're still doing well, and it's always nice to hear from her.
Great.
Okay.
So I don't know whether Chip mentioned this, but we both have Parkinson's.
Oh, no, he didn't mention that.
I've had it for 3 years, and Chip was diagnosed last year. And there's some concern that it's related to.
Well, there are people writing about this who are invoking certain ag chemicals, dry cleaning chemicals, and paraquat. We would be so little directly touched with that I'm not so sure it's relevant. But it's one of the ways people are thinking about this disease. Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
Oh, well, yeah, it's interesting. I know I had Rob Johnston, the founder of Johnny's Selected Seeds, on back a year or two ago on the podcast, and he's retired from Johnny's now, and he has Parkinson's also.
Okay.
But I know he was telling me about how he was always a big biker, and he was trying to just stay really active, because there was I know he was thinking that just in some ways maybe just staying active would
is much recommended.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, well, hey, I want to make sure and give you a chance to tell people where they can buy your book. So got a copy of it here. It is a really great book.
Well, it's just on Amazon. It's just on Amazon as a book.
Okay, all right.
Privately printed book, but it's under my name and that title.
Okay, so so if people want to get a copy, they can just go on Amazon.
It's $12 whole.
Okay, there you go. Available on Amazon, $12, Sky Blue Trades. There's a lot in this book, and I just have so much respect for the immense contribution that you both have made. I know they're regionally in Virginia, and just to the market farming community in general. All right. Maybe I should let you guys go.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Growing for Market podcast. If you've been enjoying the show, please consider giving us a follow and a rating or a review. It really helps others find the podcast. For more tips and tricks from farmer to farmer, check out our magazine at growingformarket.com. Whether you're a commercial grower or just want to grow like one, subscribe to Growing for Market magazine for the nitty-gritty of growing, marketing, and the business of market farming. We publish 10 issues per year with articles written by experienced farmers on topics ranging from tools and techniques to farm business operations and marketing. If you've been listening to the Growing for Market podcast and haven't yet checked out Growing for Market magazine, we've made a change so you can try the magazine for free. We've added a free month to the beginning of all first-time subscriptions. Try out the digital or paper magazine for a month, and if it's not for you, cancel within 28 days and you'll never even get billed. All subscriptions get you a year of the magazine, plus 150 downloadable back issues from the last 15 years and over 1,700 archived articles. With digital subscriptions starting at just $39 a year, head on over to growingformarket.com and subscribe today to benefit from over 3 decades of writing by farmers, for farmers, in Growing for Market magazine.